In the small wooden houses scattered throughout the American countryside in the 19th century, the education of children began long before any classroom. The day had a defined rhythm, rising at sunrise, gathering firewood for the stove, fetching water, feeding animals, baking bread. In rural communities in New York State, Michigan, and later in other regions of the Midwest, Adventist families participated in this daily life common to thousands of American homes. There was no obvious distinction in dress, house construction, or division of tasks. What differentiated those families was not the outward setting, but the silent intention with which they transformed each domestic act into part of a formative process. Public schools existed in many of these localities, although they were irregular, with short schedules and teachers who varied according to the season. Children helped with the harvests and missed classes during periods of intense work. In this context, the primary responsibility for moral education remained within the home. For the Adventists, newly organized as a religious movement from the 1860s onwards, the home was understood as the first space for ongoing instruction. This was not an abstract discourse, but a practice structured in daily habits. Reading played a central role. The Bible was the most common book, but not the only one. Publications printed by the young church, pamphlets and periodicals circulated among families. The Review and Herald, initially printed in Battle Creek, arrived folded in the mail and was read aloud after dinner. Children listened to accounts of missionary journeys, public debates, and administrative decisions. Thus, they learned not only religious principles, but also notions of community responsibility, organization, and discipline. The simple act of listening to reading trained attention and memory, skills valued in a time when books were scarce commodities. Saturday, observed as a day of rest, shaped another aspect of home education. From Friday afternoon onwards, tasks were reorganized so that the following day would pass peacefully. Shoes were cleaned, clothes laid out, and meals partially prepared. The children participated in this preparation and understood, through weekly repetition, the importance of anticipation and order. On Saturday, they walked with their parents to small chapels or gathered in private homes. There they listened to readings, hymns sung without sophisticated instruments, and commentaries on biblical texts. The expected behavior was serene, attentive, and respectful. These gatherings functioned as an extension of home education, reinforcing patterns of conduct learned throughout the week. Manual labor was also a tool for education. Boys learned early on to tend the land, handle tools, and record simple expenses. Girls were taught to sew, cook, and manage provisions. This division reflected the American culture of the period, not a uniquely Adventist practice. The difference lay in the constant emphasis on integrity in work. Mistakes were not treated merely as technical failures, but as opportunities to correct character. Discipline included set schedules, rigorous academy, and accountability to parents. In preserved personal diaries and letters, it is observed that many young people naturally reported the duty of completing tasks before any recreation. Temperance was another element incorporated into daily life. In a society marked by the frequent consumption of alcohol and tobacco, Adventist families encouraged abstinence and simple eating. Meals generally consisted of grains, vegetables grown in the backyard, and seasonal fruits. The decision for a moderate diet was not presented to children as a theological imposition, but as a practical choice to preserve health and mental clarity. Conversations at the table frequently touched on medical reports and personal experiences, creating a direct association between habits and consequences. The influence of public figures in the movement also reached homes. Writings by Ellen G. White circulated widely and were read as advice directed at families. In letters and articles, she described domestic scenes, recommended a balance between firmness and kindness, and emphasized the importance of personal example. These writings were received as practical guidance during a period of rapid social transformation, when industrialization and urbanization were beginning to alter the traditional rural pattern. Even so, the concrete application of these recommendations depended on each family's interpretation, adapting general advice to their own economic and regional reality. Another important aspect was the encouragement of early responsibility. Young people were encouraged to save small amounts, contribute to community expenses, and participate in family decisions. Household management served as a reduced model of social participation. In many homes, family worship took place at dawn and dusk with brief readings and simple prayers. There was no excessive formality. The focus was on regularity. This consistency created predictable structure amidst the uncertainties of rural life, marked by unpredictable harvests and frequent illnesses. Even outside the school environment, 19th-century Adventist education maintained a focus on intellectual development. Parents encouraged reading available, albeit limited, history, geography, and science books. There was an interest in understanding the world beyond local boundaries. When Adventist schools began to emerge in the following decades, they were seen as an organized extension of practices already cultivated at home, not as a replacement for parental responsibility. Thus, values such as honesty, discipline, self-control, and a sense of community were transmitted less through formal speeches and more through the daily repetition of gestures and decisions. The home functioned as a continuous space for observation and imitation. Children learned by observing how their parents treated neighbors, managed debts, and reacted to adversity. This upbringing took place in the normality of everyday life in silence and consistency. With the passing decades and the institutional growth of the church, this domestic dynamic would begin to interact with new educational structures that would alter the balance between home and school. As the 1870s progressed, the daily lives of Adventist families began to slowly transform. Small towns like Battle Creek ceased to be solely agricultural centers and took on more urban characteristics, with printing presses, sanatoriums, and workshops that attracted workers and visitors from other regions. The domestic rhythm remained similar to previous years, but the surrounding environment became more dynamic. Parents who had previously spent the entire day in the fields now divided their time between agricultural activities and jobs connected to the new institutions. This change required a reorganization of family life and, with it, adjustments in how values were taught to children outside of school. Even with the emergence of Adventist educational institutions in the 1870s, many children still received most of their education at home. The first school, officially organized by the movement in Battle Creek, had limited resources and restricted reach. For families living dozens or hundreds of miles away, the reality remained home education supplemented by local public schools. In this context, the home maintained its centrality as a space for moral and practical guidance. Reading aloud remained a primary formative tool. In addition to denominational periodicals, biographies, travelogues, and books on American history circulated, parents sought to select content that reinforced virtues such as perseverance, honesty, and a sense of duty. In many homes, the evening was reserved for these readings. After the day's work, the family gathered around the lamp. Children learned to listen attentively and gradually to read to others. This exercise strengthened self-confidence and created an environment of intellectual exchange. Discipline was applied with restraint. Personal records and memoirs published later indicate that corrections were seen as a natural part of the educational process. The expectation was that children would obey promptly and understand the reason for the established rules. Frank conversations were preferred to severe punishments, although the cultural norms of the time accepted stricter measures than those adopted today. The stated goal of many parents was to form individuals capable of self-control, not just temporary submission. Work continued to play a structuring role. In rural areas, children participated in planting and harvesting. In more urban contexts, they helped in small workshops in the printing press or with larger domestic tasks. Involvement with the printing press of the Review and Herald, for example, allowed young people to observe the book and newspaper production process. They learned notions of responsibility, punctuality, and cooperation. Practical experience complemented any formal instruction received in the classroom. The ideal of simplicity remained visible in clothing and diet. Clothes were made at home whenever possible, avoiding adornments considered superfluous. This choice was not only economic but also pedagogical. By explaining why they avoided excesses, parents introduced discussions about moderation and priorities. A simple diet, often vegetarian or with restricted meat consumption, was presented as a matter of health and self-care. Children grew up associating food choices with personal responsibility. Ellen G. White's writings remained influential during this period. In articles published in the Review and Herald, and in books dedicated to family life, she described the home as a child's first school. Her texts addressed themes such as work-life balance, the importance of parental example, and the need for consistency and discipline. These guidelines were discussed in meetings and adapted to local realities. Even so, the greatest emphasis was placed on daily practice, not on abstract theories. Another important element was community involvement. Adventist families organized meetings in homes, visits to the sick, and assistance to needy neighbors. Children accompanied their parents in these activities and observed acts of service and solidarity. These were not extraordinary events, but simple gestures incorporated into daily life. Living with different age groups within the community reinforced respect for the elderly and responsibility towards the younger generation. With the advancement of American industrialization in the late 19th century, new cultural influences arrived in the cities. Popular magazines, traveling shows, and changes in consumption patterns began to shape youth behavior. Some Adventist leaders expressed concern about these transformations. The practical response within homes was to intensify supervision and reinforce already established habits. Parents dedicated more time to direct conversation with their children, explaining differences between local customs and principles they wished to preserve. Gradually, Adventist schools began to expand beyond Battle Creek. The founding of institutions in other states brought the possibility of formal education aligned with the movement's convictions. Even so, where these schools existed, homeschooling remained essential. Teachers were seen as collaborators, not substitutes for parents. Consistency between home and school was considered fundamental to avoid contradictory messages. By the end of the 19th century, the balance between home and institution was taking on a new configuration. The presence of colleges and boarding schools broadened academic horizons, but also created challenges regarding the direct influence of parents. The tension between family closeness and institutional education would begin to shape internal debates in the following decades, redefining the role of the home in the transmission of values. At the beginning of the 20th century, the American landscape was changing more rapidly than any previous generation had experienced. Railroads connected previously isolated regions, cities grew around factories, and the flow of information became more constant with daily newspapers and illustrated magazines. Adventist families, scattered throughout states like Michigan, California, and Tennessee, participated in this transforming environment. Many already lived near church institutions such as schools, publishing houses, and sanatoriums. Even so, within their homes, the conviction persisted that the essential formation of their children could not be entirely delegated to any external structure. The growth of Adventist schools brought new possibilities. Boarding schools, such as the one that would develop around what would later become Andrews University, offered a structured curriculum with academic subjects and practical training. However, even with the consolidation of these institutions, most children still spent their early years under the direct influence of their families. Before any formal enrollment, they learned habits that would shape their behavior in broader environments. Family worship remained a constant practice. At dawn, before each member went about their tasks, they gathered for a brief reading and prayer. The meeting was repeated in the evening. These moments were not elaborate ceremonial in nature. They were simple, predictable, and short, integrated into the natural rhythm of the day. The regularity conveyed an idea of order and stability. Children grew up associating spiritual discipline with daily discipline without a rigid distinction between the two. Their relationship with work also adapted to the new urban realities. In centers like Battle Creek and later Loma Linda, young people could help in institutional kitchens, sanatorium gardens, or printing workshops. They learned to deal with fixed schedules and specific responsibilities. The symbolic payment for these tasks taught notions of personal finance. Many recorded their income and expenses in small notebooks, a practice encouraged by parents as an exercise in transparency. The influence of Ellen G. White's writings remained present, especially after the publication of books focused on education and family life. Her texts were discussed in meetings and read at home as practical guidelines for balancing study, manual labor, and moral development. Even so, the concrete application varied according to the context. Families in rural areas maintained a greater emphasis on agriculture. In urban regions, they adapted principles to the routine of commerce and services. Healthy eating became a visible part of Adventist identity during this period. The development of cereal-based food products, initially linked to the Battle Creek environment, influenced domestic practices. Even where such products were not available, the preference for simple meals persisted, with reduced meat consumption and encouragement of the consumption of grains, fruits, and vegetables. Children were involved in food preparation and learned to understand food choices as part of personal responsibility. Another relevant aspect was the control of free time. With the emergence of new forms of entertainment, such as cinemas and large-scale sporting events, Adventist parents began to carefully evaluate their children's participation in these activities. Instead of broad prohibitions without explanation, many opted for detailed conversations about content and cultural influence. The goal was to develop discernment, not just impose restrictions. Diaries of young people from that time reveal that these conversations could be long and sometimes tense, reflecting the effort to balance social integration and the preservation of family values. Reading remained central, but now also included broader textbooks. The expansion of the American educational system demanded greater academic preparation. Parents encouraged regular study at home, review of lessons, and interest in areas such as natural sciences and history. There was a growing understanding that faith and academic knowledge were not opposing fields, but dimensions that needed to coexist coherently. With Ellen White's death in 1915, a generation that had lived directly with the origins of the movement began to disappear. The responsibility of preserving domestic practices passed entirely to families and local leaders. Without the physical presence of founding figures, daily example gained even more weight. Parents understood that the continuity of values would depend less on printed documents and more on the consistency lived within the home. Throughout the following decades, especially during the First World War and the period of economic instability that culminated in the Great Depression, the home once again assumed a role of protection and stability. The financial discipline taught since childhood proved useful in times of scarcity. The practice of saving, diligent work, and family cooperation helped many families navigate difficulties with relative organization. Thus, even with the institutional growth and social transformations of the early 20th century, values education outside of school remained centered on daily domestic life. The home continued to be a space where small daily decisions shaped character and identity. As the century progressed and Adventism expanded globally, new cultures and contexts would broaden this model, adapting it to diverse realities. Throughout the mid-20th century, Adventist home life in the United States underwent profound transformations in American society. Rural electrification made tasks faster, radio entered living rooms, and after World War II, television began to occupy a permanent place in homes. Suburbs grew up around large cities, and many Adventist families left rural areas to live near educational centers and church-affiliated hospitals. Even so, despite new appliances and routines adapted to urban work, the transmission of values outside of school remained deeply rooted in the family structure. In the mornings in residential neighborhoods of California, Tennessee, or Maryland, parents left early for offices, hospitals, and publishing houses. Children walked to local schools or boarded Adventist school buses. Before each went their own way, the habit of a few minutes of reading and prayer as a family persisted. It wasn't a lengthy ritual, but a practice that marked the beginning of the day with predictability. In the evening, even with varied commitments, many families sought to repeat the gathering, reinforcing continuity between generations. The growing presence of television brought new challenges. Entertainment programs, news broadcasts, and advertising introduced diverse lifestyles and values. Adventist parents reacted in different ways. Some severely limited the use of the television. Others chose to supervise content and establish set schedules. In both cases, the central concern was to develop critical thinking. Conversations after a program became part of the educational process, with analysis of character behavior and discussion of choices presented on screen. The goal was not to completely isolate children from American culture, but to teach them to evaluate what they consumed. Healthy eating continued to be a visible element of home education. With the consolidation of Adventist medical institutions and increased production of processed plant-based foods, it became easier to maintain a diet based on principles advocated since the previous century. Children learned to read labels, understand ingredients, and associate health with personal responsibility. In many homes, cooking remained a shared activity, creating an environment conducive to informal conversations about discipline and self-care. Community involvement also played a formative role. Local churches organized service activities, hospital visits, and youth programs. Young people participated in clubs like the Pathfinders, where they learned practical skills, teamwork, and basic leadership. Although these initiatives were linked to the church, much of the internalization of values occurred in the family interaction that preceded and followed each activity. Parents discussed observed attitudes, reinforcing behaviors considered appropriate. Ellen G. White's writings continued to be published and republished, now organized into thematic compilations focused on family and education. Even decades after her death, her advice was cited in meetings and used as a historical reference. However, its practical application depended on contemporary interpretation. Amidst social changes such as the civil rights movement and transformations in the role of women in society, Adventist families adapted their practices while maintaining an emphasis on responsibility, respect, and cooperation. During the 1960s and 1970s, Adventist universities expanded their academic reach. Young people gained broader access to higher education, often temporarily distancing themselves from their family environment. This separation highlighted the importance of the earlier formative period. Parents who had invested in constant dialogue and consistent example perceived greater moral autonomy in their children when facing pluralistic environments. Education outside of school revealed its effects when decisions needed to be made without direct supervision. Financial discipline, taught from an early age through controlled allowances and encouragement to save, also remained a prominent characteristic. Even in times of economic prosperity, many households maintained a moderate consumption pattern. Children learned to distinguish between needs and wants, a habit that reflected traditions inherited from the 19th century. This moderation did not prevent social integration, but it established clear limits. At the end of the 20th century, with the arrival of the internet and new digital technologies, the historical pattern repeated itself. The external environment was changing rapidly, and the home adjusted its strategies to preserve internal coherence. Content supervision migrated from television to the computer, then to mobile devices. Even so, the fundamental method remains similar to that practiced by previous generations: active parental presence, direct conversation, structured routine, and personal example. Observing the trajectory from the rural cabins of the 19th century to the suburban homes of the late 20th century, a remarkable continuity is evident. Although Adventist schools have expanded and assumed a significant role in academic education, the transmission of values outside of school has never ceased to depend on daily home life. The repetition of simple habits, the integration of work and study, moderation in consumption, and constant dialogue have shaped identities across generations. Thus, the history of Adventist education in the United States cannot be understood solely through its formal institutions, but also through the persistent silence of the homes where parents and children learn together to organize their common life. Throughout the decades, the formation of values among Adventists in the United States occurred primarily within the home environment. Before and after the expansion of their own schools, it was in the daily life of the home and the discipline of schedules, shared reading, teamwork, and direct conversations that principles such as responsibility, moderation, and respect were consolidated. Ellen G. White's writings recorded this historical emphasis on the home as the first school, but the permanence of these values depended, above all, on the daily practice of parents. Amidst the social and technological transformations of the 20th century, the basic structure remained the same: consistent example, organized routine, and close guidance. Thus, Adventist education outside of school proved to be less a formal program and more a silent continuation of everyday life, sustained by the faithful repetition of habits learned at home.